The story begins not in the ruins of war, but in the drawing rooms, theaters, and parishes of a Europe that still believed the future could be grand. Before the smoke and rubble, before the trials and prisons, there were young women stepping into adulthood at the dawn of the 20th century. Emmy Sonnemann, born in 1893, carried herself with the confidence of a stage actress, her life lit by footlights and applause. Margarete Boden, the same age, followed a quieter path, trained in nursing, guided by discipline and piety. Ilse Hess, arriving in 1900, grew restless in a Germany that offered little space for ambition. She longed for meaning. Gerda Bormann, born in 1909, came from a family steeped in politics and conservative ideals. Lina von Osten, spirited and determined, joined them in 1911. And in 1905, Elisabeth Höss grew up unaware that she would one day live in a villa beside Auschwitz itself. Their lives seemed unremarkable then, woven from music lessons, school uniforms, Sunday rituals. Yet history was waiting. By the late 20th century, as Germany stumbled under the weight of defeat and depression, their paths intersected with men who promised not only redemption for the nation, but prestige, wealth, and purpose. Between 1927 and 1933, these women became brides of the Reich. Emmy, the actress, married Hermann Göring, the flamboyant war hero and rising star of the Nazi Party. Margarete wed Heinrich Himmler, whose cold efficiency built the SS into a machine of terror. Ilse bound herself to Rüdiger Hess, a man so utterly loyal to Hitler that he would one day risk his life in a solo flight across the North Sea. Lina von Osten married Reinhard Heydrich, whose ambition and ruthlessness would make him one of the most feared men in Europe. Gerda became the wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's shadowy secretary who controlled the Führer's appointments, favors, and secrets. Elisabeth married Rudolf Höss, who would later oversee the largest death camp in the Nazi Empire. These were not ordinary marriages. Each carried symbolic weight. To stand beside these men was to embody respectability, to reassure the public that these architects of brutality were also husbands and fathers. The women played their roles well. Emmy Göring welcomed guests into Karinhall, their estate filled with looted Renaissance art, its halls echoing with chamber music and the clink of crystal glasses. Margarete Himmler managed the family's Gmund estate, keeping order with the same precision her husband demanded of his officers. Gerda Bormann raised 10 children in Oberaltersburg, surrounded by privilege even as war crept closer. For neighbors and visitors, these homes radiated stability. The manicured gardens, the portraits in gilded frames, the children dressed in starched collars, all conveyed the image of noble German families, guardians of culture and tradition. The truth was darker, but in those years before 1939, few could see beyond the curtains drawn tight. There were small details, too, that revealed their inner worlds. Emmy's taste for jewels and silks, Margaret's insistence on discipline at the dinner table, Ilse Heydrich's sharp tongue feared even within her household. Each woman carved her identity not only as wife, but as custodian of a private kingdom where loyalty to her husband mirrored loyalty to the Reich itself. And yet, behind every polished surface, the clock was ticking. The world they curated with such care, the villas, the art, the wealth, rested on fragile foundations. When war erupted, the illusion began to unravel.
The same doors that once opened to visiting dignitaries would one day be kicked down by Allied soldiers. The jewels, the estates, the carefully crafted images of respectability, none would survive the collapse that was coming. But for now, in the late 1930s, the brides of the Reich lived at the height of their power. They smiled for photographs, raised toasts in candlelit halls, and believed the future belonged to them. But as history would show, it was not the beginning of triumph, but the prologue to downfall. The glitter of their world will soon fade, and when it does, the walls of mansions will be replaced by the bars of prison.
The end came suddenly. One moment, the wives of Nazi Germany's most powerful men lived among chandeliers and carved staircases, their homes filled with polished silver and stolen canvases. The next, those same women stood under harsh lights, hands searched, jewels stripped away, their names reduced to case numbers. May 9, 1945. Emmy Göring, once the celebrated actress turned hostess of Karinhall, was seized by American paratroopers at the Grand Hotel. In her luggage, officers discovered a jewelry case worth $40,000, a fortune in stones and gold, crammed hastily into a velvet-lined box. She had lived among Renaissance masterpieces and silk draperies, but in that moment she was just another detainee, her past no shield against the collapse of the Reich. Across Bavaria, Margarete Himmler was taken from the Gmund estate, the precision of her household routines shattered in a single knock on the door. Soldiers who once saluted her husband now confiscated family letters, uniforms, even children's toys, as evidence of complicity. Ilse Hess, meanwhile, was detained in the quiet village of Hindelang. Her husband, Rudolf, had already vanished into the strange exile of a Scottish prison cell after his solo flight in 1941. She faced the war's end without him, arrested in her own home, uncertain of his fate. The women who had presided over estates now entered the stark world of prisons: Recklinghausen, Hamburg, Lüneburg, Strobing. Cold stone walls replaced velvet curtains. Meals came in tin trays rather than porcelain bowls. They lined up for head counts, were stripped of fine clothes, issued shapeless uniforms. The clatter of keys on steel doors echoed where once there had been chamber music. Denazification tribunals soon followed. These were not the grand stage of Nuremberg, but smaller, provincial courts, rooms filled with Allied officers, stenographers, translators, and witnesses. The evidence was mundane, yet damning. Coded letters, household diaries, bank records, testimony from former prisoners who had seen wives inspecting estates built on forced labor. In Munich, Emmy Göring sat before the tribunal, her reputation dismantled page by page. Elisabeth Höss, wife of the Auschwitz commandant, faced accusations not of killing, but of knowing, her complicity etched in the proximity of her villa to the camp smoke. Sentences varied. Some women were imprisoned for several years, others released after only months. Emmy was sentenced but freed in 1948, her wealth reduced to fragments. Lina Heydrich received her own punishment, though she would later retreat to the isolation of an island boarding house. Elisabeth Höss was sentenced in 1947. That same year, Rudolf Höss was executed for crimes at Auschwitz. What stung most was not only the loss of freedom, but the loss of identity. They were no longer mistresses of estates, but inmates, marked by stigma. Their children, often separated and shuttled between relatives or Catholic charities, carried the weight as well.
Letters written during this time reveal the anguish, fears of children bullied in schools, names whispered on the street, doors shut in their faces. Inside the prisons, depression spread like a fog. Some women leaned on religious conversion, clutching rosaries in dim cells. Others fell into silence, refusing to speak of the past, refusing to admit what they had once defended so proudly. Anxiety pressed on them constantly. Would their homes be seized permanently? Would their children survive the stigma? Could they ever walk the streets again without recognition? In those years after 1945, the reality of punishment was not only legal, but social. They were marked forever. Even after release, many lived under assumed names, working small jobs, hiding their past from neighbors who never guessed the truth. But the damage had already reached a next generation. For behind the prison gates, the children grew. They were the ones who would inherit not estates or jewels, but the silence, the shame, and the burden of carrying names that history would never forget.
The war was over, but for the children left behind, the battle had only begun. They carried names that drew whispers, doors that slammed shut, teachers who looked away when they entered a classroom. Every playground, every schoolyard was a reminder that they were not just children. They were shadows of men the world wanted to forget, and yet could never forgive. Edda Göring was only 7 when her father, once the Reich's flamboyant second-in-command, stood trial at Nuremberg. For her, childhood had been castles, gowns, and the glitter of stolen art hanging on the walls of Karinhall. After 1945, it became confiscations, interrogations, and the stigma of being Göring's daughter. She never escaped it. Edda remained loyal to her father's memory into adulthood, her interviews filled with defiance, her voice carrying the pride of a past most Germans worked to bury. Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, faced the same weight. She was 16 when her father bit down on cyanide in Allied custody. Gudrun adored him. Her diaries reveal the affectionate notes of a girl who saw only a loving parent, not the architect of genocide. After the war, she became a symbol among neo-Nazi circles, unrepentant, a living thread to the old regime. Friends recall how she defended her father's name until her death, convinced of his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. For others, the path was very different. Wolf Rüdiger Hess, son of Hitler's deputy, became a man consumed by a single cause: the release of his father from Spandau prison. Rudolf Hess had flown to Scotland in 1941 on a doomed peace mission and never returned. Wolf Rüdiger spent decades writing books, campaigning internationally, insisting his father was a political prisoner, not a war criminal. His identity fused completely with his father's cause, as though by defending him, he could defend himself. The children of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, lived a fractured life. 10 in all, scattered after the war, they endured foster homes, relocations, and the loss of any stable identity. One son became a Catholic priest, another emigrated far from Germany. Each wrestled differently with the legacy of a man who had orchestrated so much destruction from the shadows of power. Perhaps most haunting were the children of Rudolf Hess, commandant of Auschwitz. Their villa stood beside the camp, with its garden overlooking the barbed wire. To them, it was home. Apple trees, a swing set, the smell of baked bread drifting from the kitchen. Only later did they understand that smoke rising behind the garden came not from fields, but from crematoria. After the war, their lives were marked by